My name is Charmaine Brooks, and 7 months ago I woke up from a surgery that was supposed to save my life and discovered that my husband had vanished. At first, I thought something terrible had happened to him. That was the only explanation that made sense. Darnell had been at the hospital when they wheeled me into the operating room. He held my hand, he kissed my forehead. He told me he would be there when I woke up. I believed him because for 12 years I had built my life around believing him. We weren't perfect, but we were married. We had survived layoffs, family drama, and years of struggling before my business finally became successful. I thought I knew who he was. I thought I knew who I had married. I was wrong. When I opened my eyes after surgery, the first thing I saw was an empty chair beside my bed. The second thing I noticed was my phone sitting on the tray table with no missed calls, no messages, no voicemail, nothing. At first, I wasn't worried. Hospitals are chaotic places. People step out to get coffee, they take calls, they run errands. I told myself he would walk through the door any minute. An hour passed, then another. Nurses changed shifts. Patients were moved in and out of nearby rooms. The chair remained empty. By evening, concern had started replacing confusion. I called his phone, straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. I sent a text asking if he was okay. No response. By the next morning, I was no longer worried about where he was. I was worried about why he was gone. A nurse named Rebecca stopped by to check my vitals. She hesitated before leaving. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Your husband told us you wanted limited visitors." I frowned. "What?" She looked confused. "He said you needed rest and didn't want anyone coming in." A cold feeling settled into my stomach. "I never said that." Rebecca's expression changed immediately. "Oh, it was a small moment, but something about it bothered me. Why would Darnell tell the staff that? Why would he prevent people from visiting me?" The question stayed with me throughout the day. Later that afternoon, I tried accessing our joint bank account from my phone. I wanted to pay a vendor invoice for my company that was due the next morning. Instead of seeing the account dashboard, I received an error message saying my login credentials were no longer valid. I tried again. Same result. Then I reset the password. The reset email never arrived. Confused, I logged into a backup account connected to my business. That's when I saw the notification. Changes had been made to multiple account permissions less than 12 hours earlier. My access had been removed. At first, I assumed it was a banking mistake. Then I checked my business email. Locked out. I checked our shared household account. Locked out. Even my cloud storage account showed unusual login activity from a device I didn't recognize. The pain from surgery suddenly felt insignificant compared to the panic building inside my chest. None of this could be accidental. Someone was systematically removing me from my own life. I called the bank. After nearly 30 minutes of verification questions, the representative finally explained that a co-owner on the account had requested administrative changes the previous evening. My heart started pounding. "Who requested them?" I asked. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't disclose that information over the phone. I already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to admit it." That night, I barely slept. Every explanation I came up with sounded ridiculous. Maybe Darnell was protecting the accounts while I recovered. Maybe there had been fraud concerns. Maybe he was handling paperwork I didn't understand. Every excuse felt weaker than the last. The following morning, my mother, Gloria Brooks, arrived at the hospital. The moment she walked into the room, she knew something was wrong. Mothers have a way of sensing things before you say them out loud. "Where's Darnell?" she asked. I looked away. "I don't know." Her expression tightened. "What do you mean you don't know?" I explained everything. The empty chair, the unanswered calls, the locked accounts, the visitor restrictions. By the time I finished, the warmth had disappeared from her face completely. "That's not normal," she said quietly. "I know." She sat beside me and reached for my hand. "We're going to figure this out." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, a terrible thought had already started forming. Darnell wasn't missing. Darnell was avoiding me. That afternoon, Gloria decided to visit our house. I expected her to call back with some simple explanation. Maybe Darnell was overwhelmed. Maybe he had fallen asleep after days of stress. Instead, her voice sounded different when she finally called. Harder. colder. "Charmaine," she said, "I need you to stay calm." My stomach dropped instantly. "Why?" There was a pause. "Your husband isn't acting like a man worried about his wife's recovery." Every nerve in my body went tense. "What happened?" Another pause followed. Then she answered. "His car is in the driveway, the lights are on. But when I knocked, nobody answered. That doesn't mean anything." "Maybe not." Her voice lowered. But I looked through the front window. I gripped the phone tighter. "And?" "Boxes." "What kind of boxes?" "Packing boxes." My heart stopped. "What?" "Someone is packing up your house." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. None of it made sense. Why would anyone be packing my house while I was recovering from surgery? Why would Darnell hide that from me? Why would he lock me out of our accounts? The questions kept multiplying faster than I could answer them. Then Gloria said something that changed everything. "Charmaine, before I left, I called a friend at the bank." My pulse accelerated. "And?" "The person who authorized those account changes wasn't a stranger." I felt my chest tighten. "Who was it?" Gloria took a slow breath. "The authorization came from Darnell." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Suddenly, the empty hospital chair made sense. The unanswered calls made sense. The locked accounts made sense. My husband hadn't disappeared. He had started removing me from my own life while I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, and somehow, I knew the worst part of the story hadn't even begun yet. 3 days after learning that Darnell had locked me out of our accounts while I was recovering from surgery, I finally stopped searching for innocent explanations. Every hour that passed made the truth harder to ignore. He wasn't overwhelmed, he wasn't confused, and he definitely wasn't trying to protect me. He was doing something deliberate. The question was why. My mother arrived early the next morning carrying a laptop, a notebook, and the same determined expression she wore whenever someone threatened her family. "Let's see how much damage he's done," she said. I wanted to argue. Part of me still wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, but deep down, I already knew better. Gloria opened my business email recovery account and began helping me piece together what had happened during the days I was unconscious. The first discovery came from one of my senior employees. A message had been sent to the entire company less than 24 hours after my surgery. The sender was Darnell. The subject line read, "Leadership Transition Update." My stomach tightened immediately. I opened the email. According to Darnell, I had decided to step away from day-to-day operations indefinitely due to unexpected medical and emotional complications. The message went on to explain that he would temporarily oversee major decisions until I recovered. I read the email twice before I could speak. "I never approved this." Gloria nodded. "I know." The worst part wasn't the lie. It was how believable the lie sounded. Employees trusted Darnell because I trusted Darnell. Clients knew him because I introduced him to them. Investors welcomed him because he was my husband. He wasn't forcing his way into my life. He was using the access I had already given him. Suddenly, another email caught my attention. Then another. Then another. Several clients had received messages informing them that I would be unavailable for the foreseeable future. One investor had been told I was experiencing cognitive complications following surgery. Another had been informed I was struggling emotionally and should not be contacted directly. My chest tightened with every sentence. Darnell wasn't stealing money. He was stealing credibility. He was building a version of reality where nobody expected to hear from me. A version where he became the voice people trusted. Around noon, one of my project managers called after finally receiving a message from my mother. "Charmaine?" he asked cautiously. "Is it really you?" The question hit me harder than I expected. "Of course it's me." There was a brief silence. "Darnell told us things were complicated." My stomach dropped. "What things?" Another pause followed. "He said your recovery wasn't going well." I felt anger rising inside me for the first time since the surgery. Not fear. Not confusion. Anger. Darnell wasn't merely removing me from accounts. He was removing me from people's minds. Every lie created more distance between me and the life I had spent years building. Later that afternoon, Gloria returned from another visit to our house. This time her expression looked even darker. "What now?" I asked. She placed several photographs on the hospital tray table. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then recognition hit me. Filing cabinets, office boxes, storage containers, documents, hundreds of documents. "What is this?" I whispered. "Your home office." The room suddenly felt colder. Darnell wasn't simply packing. He was targeting records, contracts, financial files, ownership documents, the paperwork connected to everything I had worked for. Gloria pointed to one of the photographs. "Look closer." I zoomed in. Sitting beside one of the boxes was my company seal. Another photograph showed folders containing property records. Another showed binders labeled with the names of commercial assets. Assets worth millions. My pulse accelerated. "He's preparing something." Gloria nodded. "I think so too." That evening I received another shock. One of my largest clients finally managed to reach me directly through a personal number Darnell didn't know existed. "Charmaine," he said carefully. I wasn't sure whether I should call. "Why wouldn't you call?" The hesitation on the other end immediately answered the question. "Your husband said you weren't making decisions anymore." My heart sank. "Did he?" He said doctors expected a long recovery. Every lie sounded professional, reasonable, difficult to challenge. That's what made them dangerous. Darnell wasn't acting emotionally. He was creating a paper trail, a narrative, a framework where every future action could be justified. The more I thought about it, the more terrifying it became. If enough people believed I was incapable of managing my affairs, then eventually it wouldn't matter whether the story was true. The perception alone could cause damage. The next morning, a hospital administrator requested a meeting. The moment she entered the room, I sensed something was wrong. She spoke politely, but every word felt carefully chosen. "Mrs. Brooks, we need clarification regarding some recent paperwork." My pulse immediately accelerated. "What paperwork?" The administrator opened a folder. "Your husband submitted documentation requesting expanded access to certain medical decisions during your recovery." My entire body went still. "What?" "Nothing has been approved," she added quickly. There were concerns regarding the request. Gloria and I exchanged a look. This wasn't about visiting hours anymore. It wasn't about emails. Darnell was attempting to establish authority, formal authority, the kind that could extend far beyond a hospital room. "What exactly did he request?" I asked. The administrator hesitated before answering. "Temporary decision-making authority if complications affected your ability to manage your own affairs." For several seconds I couldn't speak. I had been awake, alert, speaking with doctors, answering questions. Yet somehow Darnell was already trying to position himself as the person in charge of my life. After the administrator left, Gloria immediately began making calls. Lawyers, financial contacts, former colleagues. Not because we were planning a counterattack, because we were running out of time. Every hour Darnell spent building his story made it harder to undo. That evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, I sat alone staring out the hospital window. Then I overheard two nurses talking quietly near the doorway. Normally I wouldn't have paid attention, but one sentence froze me in place. "Wasn't that the husband who called again?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "Something about legal paperwork." My pulse accelerated. "What kind of paperwork?" the first nurse asked. The second lowered her voice. "I think he was asking about temporary authority forms or guardianship procedures." The room suddenly felt silent. Guardianship, authority, control. The pieces finally started connecting. Darnell wasn't improvising. He wasn't panicking. He was following a plan, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized exactly how dangerous that plan might be. Because if he succeeded, he wouldn't just control my accounts, he could control everything. 4 days after waking up from surgery and discovering that my husband had begun removing me from my own life, I was finally discharged from the hospital. The doctors wanted me resting. The nurses wanted me avoiding stress. My mother wanted me staying at her house until we understood what Darnell was doing. But I only wanted one thing. I wanted to go home. Despite everything that had happened, some small part of me still believed there had to be an explanation. Maybe Darnell had panicked. Maybe he had made terrible decisions under pressure. Maybe once I got home, we would finally have the conversation that would make sense of all this. Looking back, I almost laugh at how desperately I wanted reality to be kinder than it was. Gloria drove me home that afternoon. The entire ride felt strangely quiet. We both knew something was wrong, but neither of us was prepared for what waited at the end of the driveway. The first sign appeared before we even parked. A large moving truck sat in front of the house. My stomach tightened immediately. "Mom," I said softly. "Do you see that?" Gloria didn't answer right away. Her grip tightened around the steering wheel. "I see it." The second sign was even worse. Several cardboard boxes were stacked on the front porch. Some were sealed. Others were half open. Through one of the openings, I recognized family photo albums. My family photo albums. By the time I stepped out of the car, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I moved slowly toward the front door, still sore from surgery. Every step felt heavier than the last. Then I reached for the handle. The key didn't work. I froze. I tried again. Nothing. The lock had been changed. For several seconds, I simply stared at the door, the house where I had lived for 12 years. The house I helped pay for, the house where I built my business from a tiny spare bedroom, and suddenly I couldn't get inside. Gloria stepped forward and tried her copy of the key. Same result. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped outside carrying a clipboard. Shanice, Darnell's younger sister. The moment she saw us, she stopped walking. There was no surprise on her face, no confusion, no guilt. It looked like she had been expecting us. "Well," she said casually, "you're home earlier than I thought." My jaw tightened. "Why are you here?" Shanice glanced around the porch as if discussing the weather. "Helping my brother? Helping him do what?" Her eyes drifted toward the moving truck. "Organize things." The answer was so ridiculous that for a moment I couldn't even respond. Behind her, I could see strangers carrying boxes through my living room. My living room. "Open the door," I said. Shanice folded her arms. "That's probably not a good idea." "Excuse me? Darnell thinks you need some time before dealing with all this." The arrogance in her voice made my blood boil. "It's my house," she smiled. "That's complicated right now." Gloria stepped forward immediately. "Nothing about this is complicated. Open the door." Shanice's smile disappeared. "I'm not talking to you." For the first time, I saw genuine anger flash across my mother's face. Before the situation could escalate further, another voice came from inside the house. "What's going on out here?" My stomach dropped. Darnell appeared in the doorway. For a moment, I barely recognized him. Not because he looked different, because he looked completely calm. His wife had just spent days in a hospital recovering from surgery. Any normal husband would have looked worried, relieved, emotional. Darnell looked annoyed, like someone dealing with an inconvenient interruption. His eyes landed on me. "Charmaine." That was it. No hug, no apology, no concern, just my name. I stared at him in disbelief. "You changed the locks." He sighed as if I were being unreasonable. "You shouldn't be here." The words hit harder than I expected. "I live here. Not right now." Every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. "What are you doing?" I asked. Darnell looked toward the movers. "Taking care of things." "By packing my house?" "Our house," he corrected. Then he smiled in a way that instantly made me uncomfortable. "And honestly, you're not in a condition to handle this." There it was. The narrative he had been building. The same story from the emails. The same story from the hospital paperwork. The same story he had been feeding everyone behind my back. Charmaine isn't capable. Charmaine isn't well. Charmaine needs someone else making decisions. I felt anger replacing shock. "I'm standing right here." "Yes," Darnell said calmly. "And you're recovering from major surgery. That doesn't make me incompetent." His expression never changed. Nobody said incompetent. The fact that he had clearly rehearsed these conversations terrified me. He wasn't reacting emotionally. He was following a plan. Every word sounded measured, careful, strategic, like someone preparing for a legal dispute. Then my eyes drifted past him into the house. Something immediately caught my attention. My home office. The door was open. Filing cabinets stood empty. Shelves had been cleared. Boxes filled the room. "Where are my files?" I asked. For the first time, Darnell hesitated. Only for a second. But I saw it. Safe. Where? Somewhere secure. My pulse accelerated. "What files?" Gloria asked. I didn't answer immediately, because suddenly I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't random packing. The movers weren't taking furniture first. They were taking records first. Contracts, property documents, business files, legal archives, the things that actually mattered. Darnell noticed the realization on my face. "You need to stop worrying about work," he said. "Focus on healing." I stepped forward. "Move." His expression hardened instantly. "No." The friendliness disappeared. The mask slipped for the first time. Not completely. Just enough. Long enough for me to see the man underneath. Then something else caught my attention. Near the front hallway sat a black fireproof document case. My grandfather's document case. Every important family record had been stored there for years. My stomach tightened. "Open it." Darnell looked at the case and then back at me. "No." "Why not?" "Because it isn't relevant." The answer told me everything. It was relevant. Extremely relevant. Before I could push further, one of the movers walked past carrying several empty file folders. I immediately recognized the labels: property holdings, commercial assets, estate records. My heart nearly stopped. Those weren't business files. Those were family inheritance records. The realization hit me all at once. Darnell never cared about my salary. He never cared about my company. He never cared about our checking account. Those things were distractions. His real target was something much bigger. Something hidden inside the family records my grandfather had spent decades protecting. I looked back toward the fireproof case, then toward the empty filing cabinets, then toward Darnell. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood that this wasn't about a marriage falling apart. It was about an asset, an inheritance, a plan that had been prepared long before I entered that operating room. That night, after Gloria convinced me to leave before my recovery suffered further damage, we began making a list of everything missing from the house. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. Business records, financial statements, property files, estate documents. Then we discovered something that made the room go completely silent. One folder was missing entirely. Not misplaced, not packed, gone. It was the inheritance file my grandfather had ordered our family to protect for over 20 years. And somehow, it was the only file Darnell seemed desperate to find. The morning after discovering that my grandfather's inheritance file had vanished from the house, I stopped asking myself whether Darnell was hiding something. That question had already been answered. The real question was what he had found. For 2 days, Gloria and I sat at her dining room table surrounded by notebooks, old records, family files, and every document we had managed to recover before Darnell locked us out of the house. My body was still recovering from surgery, but my mind refused to rest. Every missing file led back to the same place: the inheritance folder. Not the bank records, not my business contracts, not our personal tax returns, just the inheritance file. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Darnell knew about my company. He knew where the money was. He knew how our accounts worked. If money had been his only goal, he already had easier targets. Yet he was risking everything for a file that most people in my family hadn't even discussed in years. There had to be a reason. Gloria finally broke the silence one afternoon. "Maybe it's time I tell you everything." I looked up. "Everything about what?" She took a slow breath before answering. "Your grandfather's building." The building. I hadn't heard anyone call it that in years. Most people simply referred to it as the property. But in our family, the building carried a different meaning. It wasn't just real estate. It was history. "I thought Grandpa sold most of his assets before he died," I said. Gloria shook her head. "Most, not all." She stood and walked toward a cabinet in the corner of the room. From the back, she retrieved a worn leather folder. The edges were faded from age. "I never thought we'd need this." My pulse accelerated as she placed it on the table. Inside were copies of old property records, photographs, leases, and financial summaries. As I turned the pages, memories started returning. My grandfather, Walter Brooks, had spent nearly 40 years building a small commercial empire in downtown Atlanta. Nothing flashy, nothing famous, just smart investments made over decades. Most had eventually been sold. One had not. A 6-story commercial building located in one of the fastest-growing business districts in the city. Wait, I said, staring at the records. He still owned this when he died? Gloria nodded. Part of it. My heartbeat accelerated. How much is it worth? Gloria hesitated. The building itself is probably worth several million. Several million. The number was larger than I expected, but what came next surprised me even more. The value isn't the important part, she said. Then what is? She slid another financial statement across the table. Rental income, office leases, long-term contracts, annual distributions. Suddenly I understood. The building wasn't valuable because it could be sold. It was valuable because it generated income every year. Consistent income. Reliable income. The kind of asset that could support multiple generations. Grandpa wanted it protected, Gloria said quietly. He believed families lose wealth when they focus on selling instead of preserving. For the first time, Darnell's obsession started making sense. If someone controlled the building, they controlled far more than a single payout. They controlled a long-term asset capable of producing income for decades. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked. Gloria gave me a sad smile. Because your grandfather specifically asked us not to discuss details until the time was right. That sounded exactly like Walter Brooks. He had never trusted people who chased money. He trusted patience, discipline, responsibility, the kinds of values Darnell never understood. As we continued reviewing the documents, another detail emerged. The inheritance wasn't automatic. Ownership rights depended on specific legal conditions outlined within the missing file, conditions that required original documentation. Documentation currently missing. My stomach tightened. If that file disappears. Gloria nodded grimly. Things become complicated. That was an understatement. The wrong documents in the wrong hands could create years of legal problems. Suddenly, the missing inheritance folder felt less like stolen paperwork and more like a weapon. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of my grandfather's former attorneys had retired several years earlier, but Gloria still had his contact information. After hearing a brief explanation of the situation, he agreed to speak with us. His name was Harold Green, 81 years old, sharp memory, zero patience for nonsense. The moment he heard Darnell's name, he frowned. I've heard that name before recently. Every nerve in my body went tense. What do you mean? Harold adjusted his glasses. A few weeks ago, someone contacted an office associated with one of the old estate files. Gloria and I exchanged a look. Who? Harold shook his head. I don't know. But they were asking questions about ownership structures. My pulse accelerated immediately. A few weeks ago. That was before my surgery, before the hospital, before the account changes, before everything exploded. Darnell hadn't started planning this while I was unconscious. He had started planning it before I ever entered the operating room. The realization sent a chill through me. Everything suddenly looked different. The emails, the visitor restrictions, the guardianship paperwork, the movers, the locks. None of it was spontaneous. It was preparation. The operation had simply given him the opportunity to act. That evening, Harold sent us copies of several archived records still available through public channels. Most weren't useful. Then, Gloria noticed something strange. One transaction reference appeared repeatedly throughout multiple files. A recent inquiry had been attached to it. What is this? I asked. Harold studied the document. His expression immediately darkened. That's not good. My stomach dropped. What? He pointed to a filing date near the bottom of the page. Someone recently requested preliminary transfer paperwork. The room went silent. Transfer paperwork? I repeated. Harold nodded. For ownership interests connected to the building. My chest tightened. Can that happen without me? Not legally. The answer should have reassured me. Instead, it terrified me. Because Darnell had already proven he wasn't particularly concerned with legal boundaries. Then Harold said something that made the situation even worse. The request included supporting documentation. My pulse hammered in my ears. What kind of documentation? He studied the screen. Identity verification. Ownership records. Signature authorization. I felt physically sick. Gloria looked equally alarmed. Can we see it? Harold hesitated. Not immediately. I'll need to make some calls. For the rest of the evening, neither of us spoke much. The pieces were finally coming together. Darnell wasn't stealing random documents. He was assembling a package designed to give him access to an asset worth millions. More importantly, an asset capable of generating wealth long after a single bank account ran dry. The next morning, Harold called back. His voice sounded different, more serious. I obtained part of the submission. My heart immediately started racing. And? Silence. Then one sentence. Charmaine, your signature appears on the transfer authorization. The room went completely still. I stared at the phone in disbelief. That's impossible! Harold's voice remained calm. I know. My hands began shaking. Because I knew exactly where I had been on the date listed beside that signature. I hadn't been reviewing property transfers. I hadn't been signing legal documents. I had been lying unconscious on an operating table fighting for my life. And somehow, according to the paperwork, that was exactly when I had supposedly approved the transfer of my grandfather's inheritance. The moment Harold Green confirmed that my signature appeared on transfer paperwork filed while I was unconscious in surgery, something inside me changed. Until then, I had spent days reacting. Shock, fear, confusion, betrayal. I kept hoping every new discovery would somehow explain the last one. Instead, each answer only made things worse. That night, I stopped thinking like a wife trying to save her marriage. I started thinking like a business owner trying to uncover a fraud, because that was exactly what this had become. Darnell wasn't making reckless decisions. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was executing a plan. The next question was simple. How long had he been planning it? The following morning, while Gloria handled conversations with attorneys and estate contacts, I focused on something else. Data, emails, login histories, calendar records, security logs, things people forget when they think they've covered their tracks. Darnell had spent years watching me build my company. He knew exactly how I investigated problems. If I wanted answers, I needed to start where he least expected. My old archived business accounts. Most of my primary systems remained inaccessible, but one forgotten backup account still contained years of correspondence. It took hours to sort through everything. Vendor contracts, client updates, internal reports, thousands of messages. Then I found the first crack. 4 months before my surgery, Darnell had requested copies of several property-related documents. The request seemed innocent at first. He claimed he was helping organize household records. Back then, I trusted him completely. I had forwarded everything without a second thought. Property tax records, ownership summaries, estate references. Looking at the messages now made me feel sick. He wasn't organizing anything. He was gathering intelligence. As I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Darnell had gradually increased his interest in subjects he had never cared about before. Commercial property valuations, ownership transfers, trust structures, estate law. Several browser history reports recovered from an old shared computer showed hours of research. Not over days, over months. Every discovery pushed the timeline further back. The operation hadn't started before my surgery. It had started long before anyone realized there was a problem. That afternoon, I reviewed security footage stored in a cloud archive connected to my home office. Most recordings had already been deleted, but not all of them. A few survived because they had automatically backed up to a secondary server. The first videos showed nothing unusual. Deliveries, maintenance visits, family gatherings. Then I noticed a familiar face. Shanice. At first, I wasn't surprised. She had visited our home many times over the years. Then I checked the dates. Several visits happened while I was traveling for business. Others occurred while Darnell knew I would be working late. In nearly every recording, Shanice entered the house carrying nothing and left carrying folders, boxes, or envelopes. My stomach tightened. I watched 6 separate clips, then 7, then 8. None of it proved a crime, but it proved access. Repeated access, deliberate access. Shanice wasn't helping her brother after my surgery. She had been helping him for months. The realization sent a chill through me. Around sunset, another discovery arrived. One of my former administrative assistants called after hearing rumors about my condition. During our conversation, she mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. "I always thought it was strange," she said. "What was strange?" "Your husband kept asking questions about the Brooks building." My pulse accelerated. "When?" "Months ago." "Months. Not weeks. Months." "What kind of questions?" She thought for a moment. "Ownership percentages, transfer requirements, estate documents, stuff like that." I closed my eyes. Every new piece fit perfectly into the same picture. Darnell had been studying the building long before I entered that operating room. He knew exactly what he wanted. More importantly, he knew exactly where to find it. That evening, I created a timeline covering the previous 6 months. The results were disturbing. Every major event aligned with another piece of preparation. Darnell's research, Shanice's visits, the document requests, the property inquiries, the estate questions. None of it looked accidental anymore. It looked organized. Then I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. One calendar entry appeared repeatedly across multiple records: meetings, phone calls, lunch appointments, conference sessions. The same name appeared again and again: Victor Haynes. I had never heard of him. Yet somehow he kept surfacing around the edges of Darnell's activities. Curious, I searched through additional records. The name appeared 3 more times, then 5, then 8. Property consultant, asset advisor, commercial acquisitions specialist. Every description connected to real estate transactions. My pulse accelerated. Darnell wasn't acting alone. At minimum, someone was helping him understand how to move ownership interests and transfer property rights. Whether Victor knew the full plan remained unclear, but he was involved somehow. The deeper I investigated, the more obvious another truth became. Large frauds rarely happen alone. One person might create the plan, another gathers information, another handles paperwork, another provides expertise. The operation surrounding the Brooks building was beginning to look exactly like that. A network, not a mastermind working in isolation. Later that night, I reviewed one final archive. Buried inside years of email backups sat a folder I barely remembered creating. Most of the contents were routine. Then one message caught my attention. The sender was Darnell. The recipient list included Shanice and an address I didn't recognize. The subject line made my blood run cold. Operation Transfer. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. The email was dated 4 months before my surgery. 4 months. My hands began shaking as I opened it. Much of the message had been deleted, but enough remained to understand the purpose. References to timelines, asset movement, required documents, contingencies, milestones. This wasn't a spontaneous theft. It wasn't an opportunity created by my medical emergency. It was a project. A project with planning stages, objectives, and deadlines. The surgery had simply accelerated the final phase. I leaned back in my chair, feeling physically ill. Every excuse I had secretly held onto disappeared in that moment. Darnell hadn't betrayed me during a moment of weakness. He had been preparing to betray me for months while smiling across the dinner table, while celebrating anniversaries, while discussing our future, while telling me he loved me. Then I noticed one final detail at the bottom of the email chain. A partially deleted message from Shanice. Most of the text was gone. Only a single surviving sentence remained. It was enough, more than enough. Once we get the third signature, everything moves forward. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Third signature. Not first, not second. Third. Which meant something I hadn't considered before. Darnell and Shanice weren't the only people involved. There was someone else. Someone who still hadn't revealed themselves. And whoever they were, they had been helping from the very beginning. The email titled Operation Transfer changed the way I looked at everything. Before finding it, I believed Darnell was the architect of the scheme, and Shanice was simply helping her brother. That assumption lasted less than 48 hours. The more evidence I uncovered, the less believable it became. Nobody spends months organizing a complex fraud without a reason. Nobody risks prison, lawsuits, and financial ruin for a vague promise of future wealth. Something bigger was driving them. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Shanice's role in the conspiracy was much larger than anyone realized. While Gloria focused on protecting the estate and communicating with attorneys, I continued digging through archived records from my business and home systems. I wanted facts, not theories. One afternoon, while reviewing visitor logs connected to an old smart home backup service, I noticed something unusual. Shanice's access code appeared repeatedly throughout the previous year. Not a few times. Dozens of times. Most occurred when I was traveling. Others happened during major business conferences when Darnell knew I would be out of town. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Family members visit family. That alone proved nothing. Then I matched the dates against other records. Every time Shanice entered the house, something seemed to happen shortly afterward. Files moved. Documents disappeared. Financial records were accessed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. My stomach tightened as I stared at the screen. This wasn't occasional help. This looked like surveillance. That evening, I opened another archive containing years of scanned paperwork. Most people never think about the small administrative tasks that quietly accumulate over time. Permission forms, delivery authorizations, insurance updates, routine signatures, the kind of paperwork nobody remembers after it has been filed. While reviewing several old documents, I noticed something that immediately made me uncomfortable. One signature looked wrong. It carried my name, but the handwriting felt slightly different, not dramatically different. Just enough to trigger suspicion. Curious, I compared it against verified signatures from the same period. The differences became obvious. Certain letters slanted differently, pressure points were inconsistent, small details, the kind of details most people never notice. I sent copies to a forensic document examiner recommended by one of my business contacts. I expected a cautious answer. Instead, the expert called the next morning sounding remarkably confident. "These signatures weren't written by the same person," he said. My pulse accelerated. "You're sure?" "Very." I stared at the documents spread across my dining room table. "Can you tell who signed them?" "Not from copies alone." He paused. "But someone definitely practiced." Practiced. The word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Because forged signatures don't happen by accident. They require repetition, preparation, planning. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. About 18 months earlier, Shanice had volunteered to help organize paperwork during a family gathering. At the time, I thought she was being helpful. Now I remembered something else. She had spent nearly an hour alone in my home office while everyone else was outside. Back then, I ignored it. Today, it felt very different. That afternoon, I decided to stop relying on memories and start looking for proof. One of my former office managers still maintained backups of older administrative records. After hearing what had happened, she agreed to help. Several hours later, she called me with information I wasn't expecting. "Do you remember the emergency vendor account issue last year?" she asked. The question immediately triggered a vague memory. A supplier claimed payment had been authorized incorrectly. At the time, we treated it as a clerical mistake. "What about it?" I asked. "The authorization form used your signature." My pulse accelerated, and I found the original review notes. Silence filled the line. Then she continued. "The internal audit couldn't confirm the signature. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Another forged signature. Another incident connected to paperwork. Another event that had somehow disappeared into the background before anyone looked closely. Suddenly, the timeline became much darker. The transfer authorization linked to the building wasn't Shanice's first forgery. It might not even have been her second. She had likely been testing the process for years. That evening, another discovery pushed everything even further. While reviewing old financial reports, I noticed a discrepancy involving a private family account. The amount wasn't large enough to trigger immediate alarm. Most people would never have noticed it. But after everything else, I looked closer. $8,000 here, $12,000 there, $15,000 somewhere else. Small withdrawals spread over months, individually insignificant, collectively alarming. I spent hours tracing the transactions until a pattern finally emerged. Nearly $93,000 had disappeared over the previous year. Not through one theft. Through dozens of carefully disguised transfers, my stomach twisted into knots. Whoever did this understood how audits worked. They knew large withdrawals attracted attention. Small ones often didn't. I followed the trail until it reached a familiar destination. Shanice. Not directly. Never directly. The funds moved through personal accounts, temporary businesses, and payment services before eventually connecting to obligations carrying her name. Credit cards, loans, collection notices. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Shanice wasn't simply greedy, she was drowning. Debt, missed payments, default notices, collection actions. Everything pointed to someone living far beyond her means. Suddenly, her motivation became painfully clear. This wasn't about helping her brother out of family loyalty. This was about survival, or at least what she believed survival looked like. Yet the discovery that hurt most had nothing to do with money. While reviewing archived messages, I found an email I had completely forgotten. 2 years earlier, Shanice had called me crying. A lender was threatening legal action. She was terrified, desperate, humiliated. I remembered sitting with her for hours, helping her build a repayment plan, using my own money to prevent the lawsuit from moving forward. I found the wire transfer confirmation, $40,000, no repayment terms, no interest, no conditions. I helped her because she was family. As I stared at the document, a wave of anger washed over me unlike anything I had felt so far. Darnell's betrayal was devastating. Shanice's felt personal. I had protected her, defended her, helped her when nobody else would, and somehow she still chose to help destroy my life. That night, unable to sleep, I continued reviewing the surviving security footage recovered from secondary backups. Most clips revealed nothing new. Then one recording stopped me cold. The timestamp showed a weekend nearly 5 months before my surgery. The house appeared empty. Several minutes later, Shanice entered through the side door using her access code. I watched her walk directly toward my home office. That alone wasn't unusual anymore. What happened next was, she opened the wall safe where important family documents were stored. My pulse immediately accelerated. She shouldn't have known the code. She shouldn't have known the safe even existed. Yet she opened it without hesitation. Then she removed a stack of folders and placed them on the desk. I leaned closer to the screen. My heart hammered in my chest. Because a second person entered the room moments later. The camera angle didn't reveal the face, only part of the body. A man's shoulder, a dark suit jacket, a gold watch. The figure remained off camera for most of the recording. But one thing was obvious. Shanice wasn't working alone. She never had been. And whoever stood beside her had access to information far beyond anything Darnell should have possessed. The image of Shanice standing in front of my office, safe beside an unidentified man, stayed in my head for days. I replayed the footage so many times that I practically memorized every movement. The dark suit, the gold watch, the way he never stepped fully into view. Whoever he wasn't a random visitor. He knew where important documents were stored. He knew when the house would be empty. Most importantly, Shanice trusted him enough to open the safe in front of him. That meant one thing. If I wanted to understand the conspiracy, I needed to stop looking only at Darnell and Shanice. I needed to identify the third person. The name that kept appearing throughout Darnell's records was Victor Haynes. At first, I assumed Victor might be the mastermind, the mysterious consultant, the man behind the scenes, the architect helping Darnell steal my grandfather's building. But assumptions had already gotten me into trouble. I needed facts. Through a combination of public records, business directories, and archived correspondence, I eventually found enough information to arrange a meeting. Victor agreed surprisingly quickly. That alone made me nervous. People with something to hide usually avoid conversations. Victor didn't. 3 days later, I met him in a small office overlooking downtown Atlanta. He was older than I expected, mid-60s. Expensive suit, calm eyes. The kind of man who spent decades negotiating deals and knew exactly how much information to reveal. The moment I introduced myself, his expression changed. Not fear, not guilt. Recognition. "You're Charmaine Brooks." It wasn't a question. "You know who I am?" He sighed. "I've been expecting this meeting for a while." My pulse accelerated. "Why?" Victor leaned back in his chair. Because Darnell was never going to pull this off forever. The answer caught me completely off guard. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. You know what he did? Victor laughed softly. I know what he tried to do. The distinction immediately caught my attention. Tried, not did. Then tell me everything. Victor remained silent for several moments before speaking. I need you to understand something first. I'm not part of your husband's scheme. I wasn't convinced. He seemed to read my reaction immediately. I advised him on commercial real estate questions. That's all. You expect me to believe that? Believe whatever you want. His voice remained calm. But I never advised him to commit fraud. Then Victor opened a file drawer and removed several documents. The first pages showed consultation agreements. The second contained financial planning projections. The third revealed something much more important: debt reports. My stomach tightened instantly. What am I looking at? Victor slid the documents across the desk. The real reason your husband became desperate. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. Loan balances, interest schedules, collection notices, personal guarantees, failed investment summaries. The deeper I read, the worse it became. Darnell wasn't carrying $20,000 of debt. He wasn't carrying $50,000 of debt. He wasn't even carrying $100,000 of debt. The total exposure approached $500,000, nearly $500,000. My hands began shaking. This can't be real. Victor's expression remained neutral. It is. I flipped through the pages again. Failed real estate ventures, private lending arrangements, business partnerships that collapsed, speculative investments that never produced returns. One bad decision after another. The most shocking part wasn't the amount, it was the timeline. Some debts stretched back years. Long before my surgery. Long before the inheritance dispute. Long before I suspected anything was wrong. How did I not know about this? Victor looked at me sympathetically. Because he spent years hiding it. The answer hurt because it sounded true. Darnell always handled certain financial matters himself. Not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to create distance. Looking back, the signs were there. Late-night phone calls, sudden business trips, vague explanations, temporary cash flow problems that never seemed to disappear. At the time, I trusted him. Now that trust felt like another weapon he had used against me. Then Victor revealed something even worse. Most of these aren't traditional bank loans. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He pointed towards several highlighted entries. Private capital. The words sounded harmless. The explanation wasn't. Darnell had borrowed money from individuals and private investment groups willing to accept enormous risk in exchange for enormous returns. Some operated legally, others existed in a gray area nobody wanted to discuss openly. The repayment terms were brutal. Miss a deadline and penalties exploded. Default long enough and the consequences became unpredictable. Suddenly the timeline started making sense. The urgency, the forged documents, the inheritance file, the operation. Darnell wasn't chasing wealth anymore. He was running from collapse. How bad is it? I asked quietly. Victor hesitated. Then he answered honestly. Worse than you think. He handed me another report. Several obligations were already in default. Others were approaching critical deadlines. One lender had initiated legal action. Another had begun asset recovery procedures. A third had demanded full payment within 30 days. 30 days. My pulse accelerated. So the building, Victor nodded, was his exit strategy. There it was. The truth. Simple. Brutal. Clear. Darnell believed controlling the Brooks building would solve everything. He could refinance it, borrow against it, sell ownership interests, generate liquidity, buy time, maybe even escape completely. It wasn't greed alone driving him anymore. It was desperation, dangerous desperation. The kind that makes people rationalize almost anything. Then Victor said something that changed the way I viewed Shanice's involvement. Your sister-in-law knew. I stared at him. How? Because she had her own problems. My stomach tightened. Victor opened another file. Collection actions, credit defaults, personal loans. Several match discoveries I had already uncovered, but one detail stood out. Shanice wasn't merely helping Darnell. She was financially connected to some of the same obligations, not directly responsible for all of them, but close enough to suffer if everything collapsed. Suddenly, their partnership looked different. They weren't simply stealing together. They were trying to survive together. That didn't excuse anything, but it explained everything. For the first time, I could see the pressure closing around them, the lies, the panic, the increasingly reckless decisions. Then Victor leaned forward and lowered his voice. There's something else. Every nerve in my body tensed. What? The man you're looking for isn't me. My pulse immediately accelerated. What man? The third person. Silence filled the room. Victor studied my expression carefully. I've seen him once. Who is he? Victor shook his head. I don't know his name. Frustration surged through me. Then what do you know? Victor's answer came slowly. I know he's the one Darnell was most afraid of. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Not afraid of. Working with. Afraid of. The distinction changed everything. Suddenly the conspiracy looked different again. Maybe the third person wasn't helping Darnell. Maybe he was controlling him. Then Victor reached into his desk and removed a folded document. Take this. I unfolded it carefully. At first, it looked like an ordinary repayment schedule. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to the bottom. The note contained a deadline circled in red ink. Beneath it sat a single sentence. No names, no signatures, just 7 words. If the building deal fails, people get hurt. I stared at the note as a cold wave of fear moved through my body. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized Darnell might not be the most dangerous person involved, and whoever wrote that message was still out there. For nearly 2 weeks, my life had revolved around uncovering the truth. Emails, financial records, property files, security footage. Every day revealed another layer of deception. Every answer led to a bigger question. But the handwritten note Victor Haynes showed me changed everything. If the building deal fails, people get hurt. 7 words. That was all it took to transform the situation from a fraud investigation into a race against time. For the first time, I stopped asking what Darnell had done. I started asking what he was about to do. The following morning, I met with an attorney named Rachel Monroe, one of the few professionals willing to review the situation before demanding a massive retainer fee. Unlike the dramatic television lawyers who always seem to have instant solutions, Rachel was frustratingly realistic. She spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents before delivering her conclusion. The good news is that the transfer can be challenged. I finally relaxed for the first time all morning. Then she continued. The bad news is that legal challenges take time. My stomach tightened immediately. How much time? Rachel gave me a look that told me I wasn't going to like the answer. Months. Sometimes years. Every ounce of relief disappeared. I don't have months. I know. She pointed toward the forged authorization documents. If the transaction closes before intervention occurs, things become much more complicated. More complicated. Lawyers loved phrases like that. What it really meant was expensive, painful, and uncertain. Rachel continued reviewing the file. Then something caught her attention. Wait. My pulse accelerated. What? She pointed to a reference number connected to the transfer paperwork. This isn't a completed transfer. What does that mean? It means they're still in the acquisition phase. Suddenly I sat up straighter. They're still negotiating? Rachel nodded slowly. Looks like it. For the first time in days, I felt something resembling hope. The deal wasn't finished. The building hadn't changed hands yet. Somewhere, somehow, Darnell was still trying to complete the transaction, which meant there was still time to stop him. The next 48 hours became a blur of phone calls, public records searches, and document reviews. Eventually, Rachel uncovered the first major breakthrough. A commercial investment group called Ashton Capital had entered preliminary negotiations involving ownership interests connected to the Brooks building. I had never heard of them. At first, I assumed they were part of the conspiracy. Another hidden enemy. Another partner helping Darnell execute the fraud. That theory lasted until Rachel arranged a conversation with one of their representatives. His name was Daniel Foster, Senior Acquisitions Manager. Professional, direct, surprisingly cooperative. The moment he learned my identity, he looked genuinely confused. You're Charmaine Brooks? Yes, Daniel frowned. We were told ownership authority had already been resolved. My stomach dropped. Resolved by who? Your husband. Of course. Everything always led back to Darnell. Daniel explained that Ashton Capital believed they were pursuing a legitimate acquisition opportunity. Their interest wasn't unusual. The Brooks building generated reliable income. The location was strong. Future development projections looked promising. To them, it was simply business. They weren't trying to steal anything. They thought they were buying from someone authorized to sell. The distinction mattered. A lot. For the first time, I wasn't dealing with another villain. I was dealing with people who might become allies if they learned the truth. Daniel reviewed several documents Rachel provided. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. We never saw these. Saw what? Questions regarding ownership disputes. He looked at me carefully. If what you're saying is true, Ashton Capital has a serious problem. That sentence alone changed the entire landscape. Darnell had apparently convinced potential buyers that ownership concerns were settled. The reality looked very different. Then Daniel revealed something even more alarming. We've already issued a preliminary deposit. My pulse immediately accelerated. How much? He hesitated. $500,000. The room went silent. $500,000. My stomach twisted. Suddenly, the pressure surrounding Darnell made much more sense. The transaction wasn't theoretical anymore. Real money had already changed hands. That meant expectations, deadlines, obligations, consequences. Can they get the deposit back? Rachel asked. Daniel grimaced. Depends on what happens next. Not exactly reassuring. Then he delivered the revelation that truly terrified me. The final closing meeting is already scheduled. Every nerve in my body went tense. When? Daniel checked his notes. 2 days from now. For a moment, nobody spoke. 48 hours. That's all we had left. 48 hours before Darnell potentially secured control over the most valuable asset in my family's history. 48 hours before $500,000 became leverage. 48 hours before years of litigation could begin. The countdown had officially started. That evening, I returned to Gloria's house and spread every document across the dining room table. For the first time, the situation felt visible. Not because it was simpler, because it finally had a timeline. Before, Darnell's plan felt endless. Now it had a finish line, a deadline, a moment where everything would either collapse or succeed. Around midnight, Rachel called with another update. There's something you need to know. My pulse immediately accelerated. What? Darnell isn't selling the entire building. The statement caught me off guard. Then what is he selling? Control. I frowned. Explain. Rachel took a breath. Based on these documents, he's attempting to transfer enough ownership rights to gain operational control while preserving the appearance of legitimacy. The realization hit me immediately. Darnell wasn't acting like a desperate man trying to grab cash and run. He was acting like someone trying to build a long-term escape route. Control the building. Control the income. Control the future. It was even more dangerous than a simple sale. Then another piece clicked into place. That means he still needs additional approvals. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Yes. Hope returned for a brief moment. So we can stop this. Maybe. I hated that word. Maybe. It was the legal version of a shrug. But it was still better than no. The next morning, another surprise arrived. Daniel Foster called directly. I shouldn't be making this call, he admitted. Then why are you? A long pause followed. Because something about this deal doesn't feel right anymore. For the first time, I heard genuine concern in his voice. He explained that internal reviews had already identified inconsistencies in several supporting documents. Minor issues individually, significant issues together. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to make experienced investors uncomfortable. Darnell's carefully constructed story was beginning to crack. The problem was timing. Every concern, every discrepancy, every challenge still needed to be raised before the final closing meeting. Otherwise, the transaction could move forward anyway. That afternoon, while reviewing another batch of documents, I discovered something buried inside the transaction schedule. A location, Le Petit Chateau, one of Atlanta's most exclusive private restaurants. Not a law office, not a title company, not a conference center, a restaurant. My stomach tightened immediately. This wasn't just a closing meeting, it was a celebration. Darnell believed he had already won. He was planning to finalize the deal surrounded by investors, advisors, and potential partners. He expected champagne, handshakes, congratulations. He expected his new life to begin. Then Rachel called one final time before sunset. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "Charmaine, what is it?" Silence. Then 4 words. The meeting was moved. My pulse spiked instantly. Moved when? Another pause followed. Tomorrow morning. I stared at the phone in disbelief. The 48-hour countdown was gone. We didn't have 2 days left anymore. We barely had one. And somewhere across the city, Darnell was preparing to close the deal that could destroy everything my grandfather spent his life building. The moment Rachel Monroe told me we had less than 12 hours to stop the transaction, the investigation ended. For nearly 3 weeks, I had been collecting information, connecting dots, and uncovering lies. That phase was over. Darnell wasn't planning to steal my grandfather's building anymore. He was hours away from doing it. Every unanswered question suddenly felt less important than the deadline sitting in front of us. By sunrise the next morning, Gloria's dining room looked more like a war room than a family home. Property records covered the table. Legal documents were stacked across the counters. Laptops remained open to financial reports and archived emails. Rachel arrived first. Harold Green joined through video conference. Daniel Foster from Ashton Capital participated remotely from his office downtown. For the first time since this nightmare began, everyone involved was looking at the same evidence, the same timeline, the same fraud. Yet nobody could guarantee we had enough to stop the deal. That uncertainty hung over every conversation. Rachel stood near the dining room window, reviewing the transfer packet for what felt like the 100th time. "We're close," she finally said. "I hate that word," I replied. She almost smiled. "I know." Then she pointed toward a specific section of the file. "The problem is that suspicion isn't enough." She was right. We had forged signatures, missing documents, questionable authority, conflicting ownership claims. But commercial transactions don't stop because something feels wrong. They stop because someone proves something is wrong. We needed proof. Not another theory. Not another suspicion. Proof. Around mid-morning, Daniel called with an update from Ashton Capital. His tone sounded dramatically different than it had 2 days earlier. More cautious, more concerned. "Internal compliance has serious questions now," he said. "Good," Rachel replied. "Questions are better than blind trust." Daniel agreed. "The issue is timing. If we can't provide something concrete before tomorrow's meeting, the board may still move forward." The pressure immediately returned. We weren't fighting a criminal organization. We were fighting momentum. Money was already invested. Contracts were already drafted. People wanted the deal to happen. Once enough people start moving in the same direction, stopping them becomes surprisingly difficult, even when they're walking toward a cliff. Several hours later, I returned to one detail that had bothered me since the beginning: the transfer authorization bearing my forged signature. Everyone focused on the signature itself, but something about the surrounding paperwork felt wrong. I just couldn't explain why. So I started reading every page again, slowly, line by line, date by date, signature by signature. Most people assume investigations are exciting. They aren't. Most breakthroughs happen while staring at paperwork until your eyes hurt. Around noon, I found the first inconsistency. It wasn't dramatic, just strange. One supporting affidavit referenced a notary acknowledgement completed at 11:42 a.m. on the day of my surgery. I checked the hospital records. At 11:42 a.m., I wasn't reviewing legal documents. I wasn't signing forms. I wasn't speaking to anyone. I was under anesthesia. The timestamp immediately caught Rachel's attention. "That's interesting. Interesting good or interesting bad?" She leaned closer to the document. "Interesting, useful." For the first time all day, hope flickered inside me. We continued digging. Then another inconsistency surfaced. A supporting verification form referenced an identification procedure allegedly completed that same afternoon. Again, impossible. Hospital records confirmed I remained under medical supervision throughout the period in question. One inconsistency might be explained. Two became harder to ignore. Then Harold noticed something else. Look at the commission number. Everyone turned toward the screen. Harold highlighted a sequence attached to the notary certification. What about it? I asked. Wrong format? My pulse accelerated. What do you mean? Harold adjusted his glasses. Georgia changed notary numbering standards several years ago. Silence filled the room. Then realization spread across everyone's faces simultaneously. The commission number used on the document matched an outdated format, meaning whoever prepared the paperwork copied information from an older source without realizing the system had changed. A small mistake. A devastating mistake. Rachel immediately began making calls. For nearly an hour we waited. Nobody spoke much. Every minute felt heavier than the last. Finally, Rachel returned carrying a legal pad filled with notes. The notary commission referenced here wasn't active on the date listed. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel broke the silence. You're serious? Rachel nodded. Very. Suddenly, the room felt different. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It wasn't based on opinions or assumptions. It was objective, verifiable, real. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the balance shifting. Not dramatically, not enough to guarantee victory, but enough to create fear on the other side. Then something unexpected happened. My phone rang. Darnell. The screen displayed his name for the first time in days. Everyone immediately looked at me. Rachel raised an eyebrow. You going to answer? I stared at the phone for several seconds before accepting the call. Hello? Silence greeted me. Then Darnell's voice. Calm, controlled, familiar. You've been busy. My stomach tightened. So have you. A brief pause followed. You should stop this. The confidence in his voice immediately irritated me. Stop what? Whatever you're trying to do. I almost laughed. You forged my signature. Another pause. You can't prove that. The certainty in his answer sent a chill through me, because it sounded rehearsed. Like someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. The meeting happens tomorrow, whether you like it or not. Before I could respond, he ended the call. The room fell silent. Nobody needed to ask what he had said. The expression on my face answered for me. Yet strangely, the conversation had the opposite effect Darnell intended. Instead of intimidating me, it confirmed something important. He was nervous. For the first time since this nightmare started, Darnell felt pressure too. Otherwise, he wouldn't have called. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Rachel drafted challenge notices. Daniel escalated concerns through compliance channels. Harold reviewed historical ownership records one final time. Everyone was moving. Everyone was helping. Yet one problem remained. We still needed something strong enough to stop the transaction immediately if Darnell pushed forward despite the warnings. Around sunset, while organizing old digital backups, I stumbled across a voicemail archive I hadn't opened in years. Most messages were routine. Clients, vendors, business contacts. Then I found one left by Darnell 6 days before my surgery. I almost skipped it. Then I noticed the date. Curious, I pressed play. His voice filled the room. Warm, affectionate, loving. The same voice I had trusted for years. Hey, babe. Just wanted to check on you. Don't worry about the property stuff. I've got everything under control. Focus on your surgery. I'll take care of the rest. My chest tightened instantly. Not because of what he said, because of what I now knew he meant. While reassuring me not to worry about the building, he was already preparing to steal it. While telling me to focus on my health, he was planning the largest betrayal of our marriage. The room remained silent after the message ended. Nobody needed to comment. The evidence spoke for itself. Then Rachel's phone rang. She stepped away to answer. Several minutes later, she returned looking more energized than I had seen her all week. We may have it. My pulse immediately accelerated. What? Rachel held up a document. If this verification checks out, we finally have enough to challenge the transfer before closing. Hope surged through the room. Then Rachel delivered the final reality check. But we need confirmation tonight. My stomach tightened. And if we don't get it? Rachel looked directly at me. The answer came softly. Then tomorrow morning, Darnell gets one step closer to owning your grandfather's building. We finally had a path to stop him. Maybe. but the clock showed less than 12 hours remaining. And 12 hours suddenly felt terrifyingly short. I slept less than 2 hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same thing. Le Petit Chateau. Investors shaking hands. Documents sliding across a polished table. Darnell smiling as he finally took control of the building my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. When dawn arrived, I was already awake, sitting at Gloria's dining room table surrounded by legal files and cold coffee. The clock seemed louder than usual. Every minute felt expensive. Every hour felt dangerous. We were no longer trying to understand the fraud. We were trying to stop it before it became permanent. At 7:12 a.m., Rachel Monroe called. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something had happened. "Tell me you have good news." There was a brief pause. "I have something better than good news." My pulse immediately accelerated. Rachel explained that her overnight verification requests had finally come back. The notary commission attached to the transfer authorization wasn't merely outdated, it was invalid. Completely invalid. The commission number belonged to an individual whose authorization had expired months before the document was supposedly executed. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "You're sure?" "Absolutely." I closed my eyes and let the information sink in. For weeks, Darnell had appeared untouchable. Every time we uncovered one lie, another document appeared. Every time we exposed one deception, another obstacle emerged. For the first time, we had found something objective, something measurable, something impossible to explain away. Rachel wasn't finished. "There's more." My pulse accelerated again. "What?" "The notary listed on the paperwork signed an affidavit this morning." I sat upright. "An affidavit?" "Yes." Rachel's voice carried an energy I hadn't heard before. "She says she never met you." The room went silent. Gloria looked up immediately. "What happened?" I placed the phone on speaker. Rachel repeated the statement. The notary had never met me, never verified my identity, never witnessed my signature, never participated in the transaction at all. The implications were devastating. Suddenly, the forged authorization wasn't merely suspicious. It was fraudulent from top to bottom. Gloria slowly lowered her coffee cup. "He's finished." Rachel immediately corrected her. "Not yet." She was right. We still had a problem. Fraud doesn't automatically stop a transaction. Someone still had to act on the evidence, and time was running out. Less than 9 hours remained before the scheduled closing meeting. Around mid-morning, Daniel Foster called from Ashton Capital. His voice sounded nothing like the confident acquisitions manager I had met days earlier. He sounded worried. "Compliance is escalating the review." For the first time, I heard genuine concern from the buyer's side. "What does that mean?" Daniel sighed. "It means people are asking questions nobody wants to answer." Internal attorneys were now involved. Risk officers were reviewing supporting documents. Senior management had requested emergency briefings. Darnell's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to collapse under scrutiny. Then Daniel revealed another problem hidden inside the transfer package. A secondary identity verification form contained information that didn't match public records. Not dramatically, just enough to create concern. Different formatting. Conflicting dates. Small inconsistencies that individually looked harmless but collectively painted a troubling picture. Rachel reviewed the discrepancy and immediately reached the same conclusion. These documents weren't prepared by professionals. That statement surprised me. Then who prepared them? Rachel didn't hesitate. Someone trying to imitate professionals. The difference mattered. Real estate transactions involving assets worth millions require precision. Darnell had assembled enough paperwork to appear legitimate, but not enough to survive serious examination. The closer experts looked, the more mistakes they found. The fraud was beginning to unravel under its own weight. Around noon, another unexpected discovery arrived. Harold Green called with information from estate archives. Several historical ownership records referenced procedures required before any significant transfer of control could occur. One requirement stood out immediately. Beneficiary notification. My pulse accelerated. "What's that?" Harold adjusted his glasses. Certain ownership changes require documented notification to specific parties. Rachel immediately requested copies. 30 minutes later, the answer arrived. Darnell's package contained no evidence that the required notifications had ever been issued. Another mistake. Another missing safeguard. Another crack in the foundation. The walls were finally starting to collapse. Then my phone vibrated with a new email. The sender's address was unfamiliar. The attachment wasn't. Shanice. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. No message, no explanation, just an attachment. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Inside sat an archived email chain dated 3 months before my surgery. Darnell, Shanice, and one unidentified address. Most of the conversation focused on timelines and document retrieval. Then I reached a message that made my blood run cold. Shanice had written, "She never notices anything. We'll be done before she even understands what's happening." My hands tightened around the phone. I kept reading. Darnell responded less than 10 minutes later. "That's why this works. She trusts us." The room suddenly felt very quiet. The betrayal hit harder than I expected. Not because I discovered something new, because I saw how they viewed me. Not as family, not as a wife, not as someone they loved, as an obstacle, a weakness, a person whose trust could be exploited. Gloria read the messages over my shoulder and slowly shook her head. Unbelievable. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned away days ago. What remained was clarity. Darnell didn't make one terrible decision. He made hundreds, one after another, for months, maybe years. Every lie, every forged document, every manipulation, every betrayal. And now all of them were finally converging at the same point. Le Petit Chateau. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Daniel called again. This time he sounded alarmed. "He's moving the schedule." My pulse immediately accelerated. "What do you mean?" "Darnell knows something is wrong." The words landed like a punch. For the first time, we had confirmation that he felt the pressure. Daniel explained that Darnell had suddenly begun pushing for accelerated execution procedures. Additional meetings were canceled. Internal review periods were shortened. Supporting documents were resubmitted. It looked exactly like someone trying to force a deal through before opposition could organize. "He's panicking," Rachel said after the call ended. "Good," Gloria replied. Rachel shook her head. "Not necessarily." She was right again. Desperate people make dangerous decisions, especially when $500,000 and years of hidden debt are involved. As sunset approached, one final verification request returned. Rachel opened the report and read silently for several moments. Then she looked directly at me. "This is it." My pulse hammered in my chest. "What?" She placed the report on the table. The findings were clear. Multiple inconsistencies. Invalid authorization. Defective notarization. Missing beneficiary notifications. Conflicting identity records. Independent reviewers had reached the same conclusion. The transfer package showed clear signs of fraud. For several seconds, nobody spoke. After weeks of chasing evidence, we finally had it. Real evidence. The kind investors, attorneys, and compliance officers couldn't ignore. Hope surged through the room. Then Rachel delivered the final reality check. "This gives Ashton Capital grounds to stop the deal." My heart leaped. "Then we won." Rachel slowly shook her head. "Not yet." The room fell silent again. "Why not?" I asked. Her answer came quietly. "Because tomorrow morning Darnell is still walking into Le Petit Chateau believing he's about to win." I stared at the stack of evidence spread across the table. Everything we needed was finally in front of us. The fraud, the forged documents, the lies, the missing approvals, the invalid notarization. For the first time, we had a real chance to stop him. But chances aren't victories. And less than 12 hours from now, I would be standing in the same room as the man who had spent months trying to erase me from my own life. The next morning began with a strange sense of calm. After weeks of chaos, betrayal, and nonstop pressure, I expected to wake up feeling terrified. Instead, I felt focused. Maybe it was because there were no more mysteries left to solve, no more hidden emails to uncover, no more missing documents to track down. The truth was finally sitting in front of us. The fraud, the forged signatures, the invalid notarizations, the false authority claims. For the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I wasn't chasing answers anymore. I was carrying them. That realization changed everything. At 8:15 a.m., I stood outside Le Petit Chateau with Rachel Monroe beside me. The restaurant looked exactly like the kind of place successful people chose when they wanted to celebrate important deals. Expensive stonework, private entrances, tinted windows, valet parking, the sort of location designed to make people feel powerful the moment they arrived. A few luxury vehicles already lined the curb. Investors were arriving. Advisors were arriving. The closing meeting was beginning. Somewhere inside that building, Darnell believed he was about to secure the future he had spent months planning. Rachel adjusted the folder in her hands and glanced toward me. "Still want to do this?" I almost laughed. "I've wanted to do this for weeks." She smiled slightly. "Good answer." Then we walked inside. The private dining room occupied the back section of the restaurant. Even before reaching the entrance, I could hear laughter. Glasses clinking, conversations flowing. The sound of people celebrating before a deal was officially complete. The arrogance of it made my stomach tighten. They were already acting like the outcome was guaranteed. As we approached the doorway, a hostess politely asked for our names. Rachel provided them. The woman checked a list and immediately looked confused. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't believe you're on the guest list." Rachel glanced at me. I smiled. "That's okay." Then I stepped around her and walked directly toward the private room. Several heads turned immediately. The laughter stopped almost at once. Conversations died mid-sentence. The entire room seemed to freeze. There were approximately 20 people gathered around a series of connected tables. Investors, advisors, consultants, executives from Ashton Capital, several attorneys. Daniel Foster sat near the far end. Harold Green wasn't present, but I recognized multiple individuals connected to the transaction. Then my eyes found Darnell. For one brief moment, the expression on his face made every sleepless night worthwhile. Shock. Pure shock. Not anger. Not confidence. Not calculation. Shock. It lasted less than a second before he regained control. But I saw it. Everyone saw it. His champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Shanice reacted even more dramatically. The color drained from her face almost instantly. For weeks they had operated under the assumption that I was always one step behind, one document behind, one discovery behind, one legal deadline behind. They never expected me to walk directly into the room where they planned to celebrate their victory. Silence settled across the dining room. Nobody seemed entirely sure what was happening. Daniel Foster slowly lowered the documents he had been reviewing. Several Ashton Capital representatives exchanged confused looks. One older investor frowned toward Darnell. "Who is this?" Nobody answered immediately. I decided to help. "My name is Charmaine Brooks." More silence followed. Then another investor looked toward Darnell. "Your wife?" Darnell finally stood. "Charmaine." The fake warmth in his voice immediately irritated me. "What are you doing here?" The question almost made me laugh. Interesting question. I glanced around the room. Considering everyone is apparently here to discuss my family's building. Several people immediately shifted in their seats. The atmosphere changed. Celebration vanished. Tension replaced it. Darnell forced a smile. "This isn't the place for this conversation." "Actually," I replied calmly, "I think it's the perfect place." For the first time, I noticed something important. Darnell wasn't angry. He was nervous. Tiny details revealed it. The stiffness in his posture, the way his jaw tightened, the slight delay before answering simple questions. He knew something had changed. He just didn't know how much. Shanice suddenly stood. "You shouldn't be here." The irony was almost amusing. A few weeks earlier, Darnell had stood in front of my own house and told me the exact same thing. I looked directly at her. "You said that before." Her expression hardened immediately. "This is a private meeting." "That's funny," I replied. "Because the building you're trying to take isn't private." Several investors turned toward Shanice. The room was beginning to notice things. Small things. Uncomfortable things. Questions nobody asked earlier, because everyone assumed the transaction was legitimate. One of Ashton Capital's attorneys cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should clarify what's happening." Darnell immediately stepped forward. "There's nothing to clarify." Wrong answer. Everyone felt it. The attorney's expression changed instantly. People conducting legitimate business rarely resist clarification. People hiding something often do. Daniel Foster finally spoke. "Actually, I think clarification would be helpful." Darnell looked toward him sharply. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, Daniel was no longer acting like a buyer. He was acting like someone evaluating risk. A dangerous change for Darnell. Another investor folded his arms. I'd like to hear what Mrs. Brooks has to say. The room collectively leaned toward uncertainty. Not belief, not support, just uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison during major transactions. Darnell recognized the danger immediately. Charmaine has been under tremendous stress, he said carefully. Medical complications have made some situations difficult. There it was, the same lie, the same narrative, the same strategy he had used on employees, clients, hospitals, and investors. For weeks, he had tried to build a version of reality where nobody trusted me. But this time something different happened. Nobody immediately accepted it. Daniel looked down at the compliance report sitting beside him. Several attorneys exchanged glances. The foundation beneath Darnell's story was already cracking. He simply didn't know how badly. Then Darnell made his first real mistake. He became defensive. This meeting isn't about family disagreements. One of the investors frowned. Then what is it about? Another silence followed. The question hung in the air like a weight. Darnell didn't answer because he couldn't answer. Not honestly. Every truthful explanation led directly toward fraud. Every lie became harder to maintain. I watched him searching for a path forward and realized something incredible. For months, Darnell controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every narrative, every assumption. For the first time, he was losing control. Then the private dining room door opened again. Every head turned simultaneously. Rachel Monroe entered, carrying 2 thick folders and a portable document case. She didn't rush. She didn't speak immediately. She simply walked to my side and placed the materials on the nearest table. The sound of the folders touching the polished wood seemed louder than it should have been. The room fell completely silent. Darnell's face changed the moment he saw her. Not shock this time. Recognition. Fear. Real fear. Rachel calmly looked around the room before speaking. Before anyone signs anything today, she said, there are several documents everyone here needs to review. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff seemed frozen. For weeks, Darnell had been racing toward this moment. The celebration, the closing, the victory. But standing there in the center of the room, watching the confidence drain from his face, I finally understood something. The deal wasn't about to begin. It was about to unravel. The silence inside Le Petit Chateau felt almost physical. 20 minutes earlier, the room had been preparing to celebrate a multi-million-dollar transaction. Investors were drinking champagne. Advisors were discussing future projections. Darnell was walking around like a man who had already won. Now nobody seemed interested in drinking anything. Every eye in the room followed Rachel Monroe as she opened the document case and carefully arranged several folders across the table. The shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Deals thrive on confidence. Confidence had just left the room. Rachel remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make accusations. She didn't perform. That was exactly what made her dangerous. Thank you for your patience, she said. What we're about to discuss affects every person considering participation in this transaction. One of Ashton Capital's attorneys immediately sat forward. Another investor closed his laptop. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Darnell remained standing. His expression was controlled, but I could see the tension building behind his eyes. He knew the room was slipping away from him. He simply didn't know how much damage Rachel was about to do. Rachel opened the first folder. Let's begin with the transfer authorization package. Darnell immediately interrupted. This isn't necessary. Wrong move. Several heads turned toward him. Rachel didn't react. Actually, it is. Then she continued. Our review identified multiple material inconsistencies. One of Ashton Capital's compliance officers frowned. What kind of inconsistencies? Rachel slid several documents across the table. Identity verification issues, defective authorization procedures, invalid notarization. The word notarization immediately caught everyone's attention. Investors understand risk. Attorneys understand liability. Both groups understand fraudulent notarizations. One executive picked up the document and began reading. Invalid? Rachel nodded. The commission attached to the authorization was inactive on the date listed. Silence followed. Another attorney reviewed the same page. Are you certain? Rachel calmly produced supporting records. Verified yesterday. The room became noticeably quieter. Darnell finally stepped forward. This proves nothing. Rachel looked directly at him. Actually, it proves quite a lot. She then introduced the affidavit from the notary whose name appeared on the authorization package. The statement was short, clear, devastating. The notary had never met me, never verified my identity, never witnessed my signature, never participated in the transaction. Several investors immediately began reviewing the affidavit themselves. The confidence that filled the room earlier was disappearing fast. One of Ashton Capital's attorneys slowly removed his glasses. That's a serious problem. Nobody disagreed. Darnell attempted to recover. There must be some misunderstanding. Rachel didn't even look at him. There isn't. Then she opened a second folder. Unfortunately, the notarization issue isn't the only concern. More documents appeared. More supporting records. More discrepancies. Identity verification forms containing conflicting information. Supporting documents with mismatched dates. Filing records that failed basic compliance standards. Each problem individually created risk. Together they painted a much darker picture. Daniel Foster sat silently reviewing the evidence. The further he read, the worse his expression became. Finally, he looked directly at Darnell. Why weren't these issues disclosed? For several seconds, Darnell didn't answer. Everyone noticed. Every hesitation damaged him. Every pause created another question. Rachel moved to the next issue. Beneficiary notification requirements. Several attorneys immediately looked up. They understood the significance before anyone else did. Historical ownership agreements connected to the Brooks building required specific notifications before major ownership control changes could occur. No such notifications existed. Not one. Another missing safeguard. Another missing protection. Another reason the transaction looked increasingly unreliable. One of the investors leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. This is becoming uncomfortable. Nobody argued, because it was very uncomfortable. The deal that looked clean yesterday suddenly looked contaminated. Darnell recognized the danger and shifted strategies. Instead of defending the documents, he attacked me. Charmaine isn't telling the whole story. Several people turned toward him. She's been under enormous stress. There it was again. The same narrative, the same lie he had been repeating since the hospital. Medical complications, emotional instability, impaired judgment. For weeks it worked because nobody had heard my side. Today was different. Rachel calmly reached into another folder. Interesting point. Darnell's expression tightened immediately. Rachel produced a printed transcript and placed it on the table. Then perhaps everyone should hear this. My stomach tightened as I recognized the document. The voicemail. The message Darnell left before my surgery. Rachel handed copies to several attendees. One investor began reading immediately. Another attorney skimmed the transcript. Then Rachel spoke. 6 days before surgery, Mr. Brooks reassured his wife that he was handling property matters in her best interest. She paused. At the same time, he was actively pursuing transfer strategies that would remove her control over the asset. The contradiction landed hard. Several people looked toward Darnell, not with anger, with doubt. And doubt was far more dangerous. Darnell opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time all morning, he seemed unsure of what to say. Around the table, the mood continued shifting. Investors stopped discussing opportunities. They started discussing exposure. Attorneys stopped discussing acquisition structures. They started discussing liability. Risk officers stopped evaluating returns. They started evaluating damage. The entire room was turning against the transaction. Then the first public break finally happened. One of the senior investors, a man who had remained mostly silent throughout the meeting, pushed his chair back slightly. "We're not signing anything today." The statement echoed across the room. Nobody challenged it. Nobody even looked surprised. Another investor nodded. Then another. Daniel Foster closed the acquisition file sitting in front of him. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Darnell saw it too. His face tightened. The transaction wasn't dead yet, but for the first time, It had stopped moving forward. Momentum had reversed. That realization hit him hard. Suddenly, the calm businessman disappeared. The man standing in front of the room now looked much closer to the person hidden beneath months of lies. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. Several people looked startled. The polished professionalism was gone. Desperation was starting to appear. Rachel remained completely calm. The only mistake here was filing fraudulent documents. Darnell turned toward her. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Actually, I do." "No." His voice rose again. "You don't understand what's at stake." The room fell silent. That sentence changed everything. Because it wasn't the response of an innocent man. It was the response of someone under pressure. Someone afraid. Someone running out of options. Darnell immediately seemed to realize his mistake, but it was too late. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. Then something unexpected happened. One of Ashton Capital's senior advisors, a gray-haired man who had barely spoken all morning, slowly flipped through several pages. His eyes stopped on a familiar name. Victor Haynes. The advisor frowned. "Wait." The room turned toward him. "What?" Daniel asked. The man looked down again, then back toward Darnell. "Why is Victor Haynes involved in this?" For the first time all day, genuine panic flashed across Darnell's face. Not concern, not frustration, panic. The reaction lasted only a second, but it was enough. Everyone saw it. Every investor, every attorney, every executive, every person in the room suddenly understood that Victor Haynes mattered. A lot. The gray-haired advisor slowly lowered the document. "I know that name." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The entire room seemed to freeze again. Then the advisor looked directly at Darnell and asked a question that immediately changed the direction of the meeting. "What exactly haven't you told us?" The moment the gray-haired advisor mentioned Victor Haynes, the atmosphere inside Le Petit Chateau changed again. Until then, the room had been focused on one question. Had Darnell submitted fraudulent documents? Now a second question emerged. Who exactly had been helping him? The advisor slowly closed the file in front of him and looked directly at Darnell. "I haven't seen that name in years." Nobody spoke. Every eye in the room remained fixed on him. Darnell's face had lost what little confidence remained. His jaw tightened. Shanice looked down at the table. Rachel stood quietly beside me, allowing the silence to do its work. Finally, Daniel Foster spoke. "You know Victor Haynes?" The advisor nodded slowly. "Professionally." He paused. "Victor isn't the type of person who participates in document fraud." That statement immediately caught everyone's attention, especially mine. The advisor continued. "He spent decades cleaning up financial disasters, restructuring debt, negotiating settlements, preventing bankruptcies. My pulse accelerated because it matched the Victor I met. Calm, practical, direct. Not a criminal mastermind. Not a hidden villain, just someone who worked with people whose financial lives were collapsing." The advisor looked back toward Darnell. "So why is his name attached to this transaction?" For several seconds, Darnell said nothing. Then he finally answered. "He was advising me." "About what?" another investor asked. Silence followed. Then Darnell gave the answer he had been avoiding for weeks. "Debt." The word seemed to settle across the room like a weight. Nobody looked surprised. Not anymore. Too many pieces already pointed in that direction. But hearing him admit it publicly changed everything. "How much debt?" Daniel asked. Darnell didn't answer immediately. The hesitation spoke louder than any number. "A lot," he finally said. The room remained silent. Then Rachel calmly responded. "Approximately $500,000. Several heads turned sharply toward Darnell. No one expected the number to be that large. One investor slowly leaned back in his chair. Another removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Suddenly, the transaction no longer looked like a business opportunity. It looked like a rescue attempt for a drowning man. The advisor nodded slowly. "Now Victor makes sense." Daniel frowned. "Explain." The older man folded his hands together. "People hire Victor when they're desperate, when lenders are calling, when obligations are falling apart, when they need options." I watched Darnell carefully. He wasn't denying any of it. For the first time since this began, he seemed exhausted. Months of lies were finally catching up to him. Rachel opened another folder. Victor confirmed that he advised Mr. Brooks regarding debt restructuring and potential asset strategies. She paused. He also confirmed he was never informed that forged documents were being used. Several people immediately looked toward Darnell. That revelation mattered. A lot. Victor wasn't the architect of the fraud. He wasn't helping create fake paperwork. He wasn't directing the conspiracy. He had been working with incomplete information. The room understood the distinction immediately. Daniel looked down at the compliance report. So Victor wasn't helping steal the building. No, Rachel said. He believed he was discussing legal financial options. Another piece of the mystery finally clicked into place. The third person everyone had been searching for wasn't Victor. Victor had been a distraction, an important one, but still a distraction. The real pressure came from somewhere else. Rachel opened another file. There's one more issue. Darnell closed his eyes briefly, almost as if he already knew what was coming. Several communications reference a third party connected to repayment deadlines. The room grew quiet again. Daniel frowned. The person behind the threats? Rachel nodded. Most likely. One investor immediately asked the obvious question. Who are they? Rachel looked toward me, then back toward the room. Not a criminal organization. Relief visibly crossed several faces. Not organized crime. Not a cartel. Not anything dramatic. Another pause followed. A private lender representative. That answer sounded almost boring. Until she explained further. Darnell had accepted funding from several high-risk private investment groups. One representative handled communication regarding repayment obligations, collections, deadlines, enforcement procedures. Nothing illegal, but extremely aggressive. The note Victor showed me suddenly made sense. If the building deal fails, people get hurt. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a threat of financial destruction, lawsuits, asset seizures, bankruptcy actions, professional ruin, everything Darnell feared. The entire mystery that had stretched across multiple weeks suddenly became clear. Darnell wasn't running toward wealth. He was running away from collapse. The problem was that he chose fraud as his escape route. Then Daniel asked a question that changed the mood again. When did this start? Everyone looked toward Darnell. For several seconds, he stared at the table. Then he finally answered. Before the surgery. The room became completely silent. I already knew the answer, but hearing him admit it publicly felt different. One investor frowned. How long before? Another pause. Months. No one spoke. No one moved. Every person in the room understood the implication. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a desperate decision made under pressure. This was preparation, planning, strategy. Darnell had spent months creating the conditions necessary to take control of the building, before the hospital, before the recovery, before I ever realized there was a problem. The final illusion disappeared. Even people who entered the room sympathetic to him were losing that sympathy fast. Then something unexpected happened. Shanice spoke. We didn't think it would go this far. Every head turned toward her. She immediately seemed to regret speaking. Rachel looked directly at her. How far did you think it would go? Shanice didn't answer, but the damage was already done. The room had just heard an admission. Small, incomplete, but an admission nonetheless. They knew what they were doing. They knew they were crossing lines. The only thing they didn't anticipate was getting caught. Then Daniel slowly pushed his chair away from the table. This transaction is finished. The statement landed heavily. No one argued. No one objected. Even Darnell remained silent. The deal was dead. Ashton Capital would not proceed. The investors would not proceed. The attorneys would not proceed. Months of planning had collapsed in less than 2 hours. Yet Rachel wasn't done. She opened one final folder. Before we conclude, there's one document everyone should see. Darnell's head immediately lifted. For the first time all morning, genuine fear returned to his face. Not concern. Not frustration. Fear. Rachel removed a printed email chain and placed copies on the table. This was recovered from archived records. Daniel picked up the first page. So did the investors. So did the attorneys. I already knew what was inside. Darnell apparently did too. Because the moment he saw the subject line, the color drained from his face. Operation Transfer. The room grew silent once again as people began reading. Then one investor stopped halfway through the first page and looked up. You knew? Another attorney turned several pages and frowned. You knew these documents weren't legitimate. More pages turned, more faces changed, more expressions hardened. The email chain didn't suggest uncertainty. It didn't suggest confusion. It didn't suggest a misunderstanding. It showed planning, deliberate planning, timelines, objectives, contingencies, discussions about signatures, discussions about access, discussions about moving forward before questions could be asked. Every excuse Darnell might have used disappeared under the weight of his own words. The room no longer saw a desperate businessman who made mistakes. They saw a man who knowingly built a fraud. And for the first time since this nightmare began, there was nowhere left for him to hide. The room remained silent for several seconds after the final pages of Operation Transfer were distributed. Nobody needed additional explanations anymore. The emails spoke for themselves. Timelines, planning stages, discussions about signatures, references to document access. Every excuse Darnell had attempted to construct throughout the morning collapsed under the weight of his own words. Around the table, investors continued reading while attorneys quietly exchanged looks that grew more serious with every passing minute. The atmosphere no longer resembled a business meeting. It felt like the aftermath of a disaster. Daniel Foster slowly closed the email packet and leaned back in his chair. We're done. The words landed heavily. Simple, direct, final. Darnell immediately turned toward him. You can't just walk away. Daniel looked genuinely stunned by the statement. Actually, we can. Another Ashton Capital executive nodded. This transaction is over. The reality finally arrived. Months of planning, months of deception, months of manipulation. Finished. Not because Charmaine screamed, not because a judge appeared, not because the police burst through the doors, because nobody in the room trusted Darnell anymore. And without trust, the deal had no oxygen left. One by one, folders began closing. Laptops shut. Pens disappeared into briefcases. Investors who had arrived expecting opportunity were now preparing exits. Darnell watched it happen in real time. Every movement felt like another piece of his future walking out the door. You're making a mistake, he said again, but his voice sounded weaker now, less certain. The room no longer belonged to him. Daniel stood first, then one of the attorneys, then another investor. Momentum had fully reversed. The same force that almost carried Darnell to victory was now dragging him toward failure. That's when he snapped. This isn't all my fault. The outburst immediately froze the room. Several people turned back toward him. For the first time all day, the carefully controlled businessman disappeared completely. What remained was a frightened man watching his life collapse. I didn't create this alone. There it was. The beginning of the blame. The beginning of the unraveling. Darnell turned sharply toward Rachel. She manipulated everything. Rachel didn't even react. No. Then he pointed toward Daniel. You people changed your story the second things became difficult. Daniel laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because the accusation was absurd. We changed our position when we discovered fraud. Darnell opened his mouth, then closed it again. The answer had landed exactly where it needed to. Several investors nodded in agreement. Then he looked toward the person sitting closest to him. Shanice. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence carried years of shared secrets, years of loyalty, years of bad decisions. Then Darnell made the mistake that destroyed whatever remained between them. You should have been more careful. The room went completely still. Shanice stared at him. Excuse me? Darnell's frustration finally overwhelmed his judgment. The signatures, the documents, the records, you kept making mistakes. I watched the realization spread across Shanice's face, not shock, recognition. She finally understood what was happening. Darnell was sacrificing her. If someone had to take the fall, he had already chosen who it would be. You're blaming me? She asked quietly. I'm saying your mistakes helped create this. Several investors exchanged looks. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. They weren't watching a business dispute. They were watching co-conspirators turn on each other. Shanice slowly stood. My mistakes? Darnell immediately realized he had gone too far, but it was too late. Months of pressure, fear, and resentment were finally surfacing. You were the one who wanted the building, Shanice said. The room became even quieter. You were the one who kept pushing. Darnell's expression darkened. Stop talking. Wrong thing to say. Shanice laughed bitterly. No. For the first time, she looked more angry than afraid. You told me everything would be fine. Another investor slowly sat back down. Nobody wanted to leave now. The deal was dead. But something else was happening. Something far more revealing. You said we'd solve the debt. Darnell stepped forward. Shanice, you said nobody would ever know. The mask had completely shattered. Years of hidden conversations were suddenly spilling into public view. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. Then Shanice delivered the statement that ended any remaining sympathy for Darnell. This whole thing was your idea. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Several people looked directly at Darnell. Others looked down at the emails. The evidence already pointed in that direction. Hearing it from his own sister made it impossible to ignore. Darnell looked trapped. Every path forward led somewhere worse. Deny it and the emails contradicted him. Admit it, and the room abandoned him completely. Then he did something unexpected. He stopped pretending. The anger finally surfaced. What choice did I have? The words echoed across the room. Nobody responded. Darnell looked around at the investors, the attorneys, the executives, and finally me. Do you have any idea what happens when people are calling every day? His voice continued rising. Do you know what it's like watching everything you've built disappear? There it was. The justification. Not an apology. Not remorse. Justification. He still wanted everyone to understand why he did it. The problem was that understanding isn't forgiveness, especially after fraud. So you stole from your wife? Daniel asked quietly. Darnell didn't answer, because there wasn't a good answer. Then I finally spoke. I helped you. The room turned toward me. When your business failed, I helped. Darnell looked away. When creditors started calling, I helped. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. When Shanice needed help, I helped. That one caught everyone's attention. I looked directly at Shanice. 2 years ago, I transferred $40,000 to stop a lawsuit against you. Several heads turned sharply. Shanice froze. Charmaine, no. My voice remained calm. They should know. The room waited. You told me you were terrified. You told me you didn't know how to survive. You cried in my kitchen. Shanice couldn't meet my eyes. And I believed you. Silence settled across the room. Not the awkward silence from earlier. A heavier silence. The kind created when people realize the full scale of a betrayal. Several investors looked visibly uncomfortable. Not because of the money. Because of the trust, the kindness, the loyalty that had been repaid with deception. For the first time all day, Shanice's confidence disappeared completely. Her shoulders lowered. Her eyes filled with tears. She seemed unable to stop. Karma doesn't always arrive through punishment. Sometimes it arrives through shame. Then Daniel's phone rang. The timing felt almost unreal. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Excuse me. He stepped away briefly before returning a few minutes later. His expression had changed. Interesting timing. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked directly at Darnell. One of your lenders just filed an emergency action this morning. My pulse accelerated. Darnell's face went pale. What? Daniel didn't sound happy. Or angry. Just factual. Looks like they were expecting this deal to close. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. The transaction had been Darnell's lifeline. Without it, the pressure waiting outside this restaurant would return immediately, not eventually. Immediately. For the first time since walking into Le Petit Chateau, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of embarrassment, not fear of exposure, fear of consequences. Real consequences. The kind that couldn't be talked away, couldn't be manipulated away, couldn't be forged away. As the room slowly began emptying, Darnell remained frozen beside the table. The deal was gone. The investors were leaving. His sister had turned on him. The emails were public. The fraud had been exposed. And now the debts he spent months running from were finally catching up. For the first time since this nightmare began, he understood what I had understood weeks earlier. There was no escape plan left, only consequences. 9 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Brooks building and watched a young couple carry boxes into their new office space on the third floor. The woman looked excited. The man looked nervous. They reminded me of people trying to build something meaningful from nothing. The kind of people my grandfather always believed deserved a chance. Sunlight poured through the front windows, reflecting off the polished floors and filling the building with a warmth I hadn't noticed as a child. Back then, it was just a building. A collection of offices and tenants, a place adults talked about during family dinners. It wasn't until I almost lost it that I finally understood what my grandfather had spent decades protecting. It was never about the property itself. It was about the people whose lives depended on it. The months following Le Petit Chateau had been difficult, exhausting, and expensive. But for the first time in a long time, difficult work was producing positive results instead of new disasters. Ashton Capital formally withdrew from the transaction within days of the meeting. Their attorneys preserved the evidence and documented every concern uncovered during the review process. Several investors quietly distanced themselves from everyone involved. The acquisition died exactly where it should have died. On paper, under scrutiny, in daylight. The fraud investigation moved much slower than television would have people believe. There were no dramatic arrests, no surprise courtroom confessions, no overnight victories, just investigators, attorneys, financial records, emails, and months of patient work. The same evidence that destroyed the transaction eventually created consequences neither Darnell nor Shanice could escape. Civil actions followed. Multiple parties pursued claims connected to the forged documentation and financial damages. Several creditors accelerated collection efforts after learning the building transaction had collapsed. The pressure Darnell spent months trying to outrun finally caught him. Piece by piece, the life he built around deception came apart. Assets were sold, accounts were frozen, settlement negotiations replaced investment plans. The future he had risked everything to create never arrived. In the end, he didn't lose because I destroyed him. He lost because every lie eventually demanded payment. Shanice's outcome looked different but hurt just as much. Family relationships that survived for decades collapsed almost overnight. Trust disappeared. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls stopped being returned. People who once defended her no longer could. The hardest part wasn't financial. It was personal. She had spent so much time chasing rescue that she destroyed the people who would have helped her. The last time we spoke, she apologized. Not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly. The way people do when they finally run out of excuses. I accepted the apology. But acceptance isn't the same thing as restoration. Some bridges burn only once. The legal protections surrounding the Brooks building changed completely after the case. Ownership procedures were strengthened. Independent oversight was added. Documentation requirements expanded. Future transfers would require multiple layers of verification. No single person could ever attempt something similar again. The building was finally safer than it had been before any of this started. That mattered more than most people realized. Because protecting the building wasn't simply about protecting an asset. It was about protecting a promise. A promise my grandfather made long before I was born. Several months after the investigation concluded, Harold Green called and asked me to meet him at his office. His voice sounded unusually emotional. When I arrived, he handed me a sealed envelope. The paper looked old. The handwriting on the front stopped me immediately. Walter Brooks, my grandfather. Harold smiled sadly. He told me to give this to you if there ever came a day when the building was truly at risk. For several seconds, I simply stared at the envelope. Then I opened it. Inside sat a handwritten letter. The pages were yellow with age. The handwriting was unmistakable. I could almost hear his voice as I began reading. Charmaine, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I hoped nobody in our family would ever have to carry this burden. But hope isn't a strategy. That's why I prepared this letter. I smiled through tears already forming in my eyes. That sounded exactly like him. The letter continued. For years, people assumed I kept the building because it was valuable. They were wrong. I kept it because it was useful. Money helps families, but purpose sustains them. Every generation faces people who believe wealth exists to be consumed. They measure success by what they can take. I learned long ago that real success is measured by what remains after you're gone. I paused and looked around Harold's office before continuing. The next lines hit even harder. The building was never meant to make anyone rich. It was meant to create opportunities. It helped small businesses survive. It helped families build stability. It helped communities grow stronger. If someone ever tries to convince you that the building matters because of its price, they have already missed the point. By the time I reached the final page, tears were running down my face. Not because of the money, not because of the legal battles, because for the first time, I fully understood why he fought so hard to protect it. The last paragraph was short. Simple. Perfect. If you are reading this, then you protected something worth saving. Not because it belonged to us, because it belonged to the future. I carried that letter with me for weeks afterward. Then one afternoon, I returned to the building and walked through every floor. I visited small businesses. I spoke with tenants. I watched employees helping customers. I watched entrepreneurs building companies. I watched ordinary people creating better lives for their families. Everywhere I looked, I saw exactly what my grandfather described. Opportunity. Not wealth. Opportunity. The thing Darnell never understood. My company recovered too. Slowly. Patiently. Some clients returned immediately. Others took time. A few never came back. That's how life works. Not every loss can be reversed, but enough returned to remind me that trust, when earned honestly, survives longer than people expect. By the end of the year, the business was stronger than it had been before my surgery. Not because I worked harder, because I finally stopped carrying people who were willing to betray me. One evening, while reviewing reports from the building, I came across an article discussing a series of creditor actions connected to several failed investment ventures. Darnell's name appeared briefly in the story. Nothing dramatic, no headlines, no spectacle, just consequences, real consequences, the kind that arrive quietly and stay for years. I stared at the article for a moment before closing it. Surprisingly, I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not revenge. Just closure. The man who spent months trying to take my grandfather's legacy ultimately lost his own, not because of me, because of the choices he made when nobody was watching. Later that evening, I stood alone inside the lobby as the last tenants finished their workday and headed home. The building grew quiet. The same sunlight that greeted me months earlier now faded through the windows as evening settled across the city. I looked around one final time and thought about everything that had happened. The hospital, the lies, the forged signatures, the debts, the betrayal, the investigation, the meeting at Le Petit Chateau. Every step of the journey had led back to this moment. A building still standing, a promise still intact, a future still protected. My grandfather was right. Wealth isn't what people manage to keep for themselves. It's what survives after someone tries to steal it.